I'll write both stories. Here's the first one for Victorian bonds." She set the silver fork down without a sound, and no one at the table seemed to notice. That was the thing about Whitmore House. It had a way of swallowing small moments whole, of making the significant disappear into the wallpaper, alongside the faded roses and the water stains no one spoke of. Elspeth Vane had learned this in the first month of her marriage. By the second year, she had grown so quiet herself that even the housemaids sometimes startled when they found her standing in a room. It had not always been this way. She had been 22 when her father signed the papers. Not the marriage certificate. That came 3 weeks later, in a church that smelled of old stone and someone else's lilies. The papers she meant were the ones spread across her father's writing desk on a gray Tuesday in November. The ones that had passed her from one set of hands to another as cleanly as the deed to a field. Her father owed money. The Whitmore family had it. The arrangement was, as her mother said with a brightness that didn't reach her eyes, entirely sensible. Cressida Vane had loved her daughter. Elspeth never doubted that. But love, she had discovered, was a thing that bent under enough financial pressure, and her mother had bent without breaking, and called it wisdom. His name was Aldous Whitmore. He was 37, spare in the way of men who eat only what they need, and he had a face that was not unkind but was not warm either. The face of a man who had learned very early that warmth cost something and had decided the price was not worth paying. He had looked at Elspeth on their wedding day, the way he might look at a piece of furniture delivered to the wrong room. Not displeased exactly, just uncertain of the arrangement. They had been married 2 years and 4 months. He was not cruel. She wanted to be very precise about that, because she had known women who married cruel men and she knew the difference. Aldous Whitmore did not shout. He did not raise his hand. He simply forgot. He forgot she was in the room. He forgot she had opinions. He forgot, most particularly, that she had a mind that worked in complete sentences and had once, before Whitmore House, before the papers on the desk, been called clever by people who meant it. His mother, however, remembered everything. Mrs. Veldra Whitmore had the posture of a woman who had won every argument she had ever entered and was always looking for the next one. She was 61, sharp-faced, and moved through her son's house with the particular authority of someone who had never technically been asked to leave. She had her own suite on the second floor. She had opinions about the menu, the flower arrangements, the thread count of the guest linens, and about Elspeth. The opinions about Elspeth were not delivered as opinions. They arrived as observations. At dinner, at tea time, in the hallway in passing. Small, precise, perfectly placed, like pins. "You've put on a little color in the cheeks. That shade of dress can do that. A woman who reads so much should really have more to say." Aldous' first intended, not a formal engagement, nothing official. She had a gift for entertaining. I always thought it was the way she listened. People felt attended to. Elspeth had learned to smile at these. She had learned to make the smile reach her eyes. She had learned to say, "Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore," and mean nothing by it, and to go upstairs afterward and sit by the window and look at the garden for a long time before she trusted herself to speak to anyone. She did not write home about it. Her mother had bent, and Elspeth would not add to the weight. The dinner that changed everything happened on a Wednesday in March, in the 3rd year of Elspeth's marriage. There were guests, a Mr. and Mrs. Edgecombe, who were related to Veldra through some complicated line of cousins, and their son Piers, who was 25 and worked in law and had the easy confidence of a man who had never once been underestimated. The table was set for 6. The soup was a clear consommé. The candles were the expensive ones Veldra had sent from London, which meant the occasion was being marked, which meant Veldra had an intention. She announced it over the fish course. "I was speaking to Aldous just this morning," she said, to no one in particular, and everyone simultaneously, in the way she had, about the east parlor. The furniture arrangement has never been right. A woman with a proper eye for proportion would have seen it immediately. She set her wine glass down. She did not look at Elspeth. But then, not everyone has that particular training. Mrs. Edgecombe murmured something sympathetic. Piers Edgecombe studied his plate. Aldous said nothing. He said nothing the way he said nothing to all of it. With a kind of settled quiet that Elspeth had spent 2 years trying to read, and had finally decided was not indifference so much as exhaustion. He was a man who had been managed by his mother for 37 years, and had made his peace with it so completely that he no longer noticed the walls of it. Elspeth set her fork down. Not dramatically. Not with the sharp click of a woman making a statement. She set it down the way she had learned to do everything in this house. Quietly, carefully, without drawing notice. She looked at her plate. The fish was sole, poached, with a dill sauce. She had ordered it herself from the cook that morning. No one at the table knew this because no one had asked. She thought about the letter. It had arrived 4 days ago, tucked inside a larger envelope addressed to her father. Forwarded on because the original sender had not known her married address. It was from a woman named Mrs. Josephine Holt, who ran an agency in Edinburgh that placed educated women in positions of household management and estate administration. Mrs. Holt had known Elspeth's aunt, who had mentioned her niece's capabilities to several people over the years, and word had eventually, circuitously, reached the right desk. The position was in Inverness. The family was the Drummond Fairfaxes, a widower with 3 young children and a substantial estate that needed someone with, as Mrs. Holt put it, a clear head, an organized nature, and the kind of practical intelligence that cannot be taught but can, when found, be relied upon absolutely. The salary was real. The position was real. Elspeth had read the letter 3 times, and then put it in the small cedar box at the bottom of her traveling trunk, where Veldra's opinions could not reach it. She had told no one. She looked at Aldous across the candles. He was listening to Mr. Edgecombe describe a property dispute with the detached interest of a man who was present in body and traveling elsewhere in mind. He had kind hands, Aldous. She had noticed this about him early and never stopped noticing it. He could have been, she sometimes thought, a genuinely decent man in a different life. In a life where someone had taught him that the people around him had interior worlds worth attending to. But no one had taught him that. And she was 24 years old, and she had waited 2 years to see if he would learn it on his own. And he had not. Veldra spoke again, still regarding the candle flame. Piers, your mother tells me you've been making quite a name for yourself at the firm. Something to do with estate law? Land disputes, mostly, Piers said, with the careful modesty of a man who knew he was being displayed and was trying to wear it lightly. Boundary clarifications. It's detailed work, useful work, Veldra said. A man who understands property understands consequence. She reached for her wineglass. Not everyone does. The implications settled over the table like a cloth. Elspeth felt Aldous go still across from her. He still did not speak. She picked up her fork. She finished the fish. She ate the syllabub that came after, which was very good, because the cook was talented and deserved acknowledgement even when the evening did not. She said the right things to Mrs. Edgecombe about her health and her journey from Surrey. She complimented Piers on his work without meaning anything by it. She thanked Veldra for the candles, and when she went upstairs, she took the cedar box from the bottom of the trunk and read the letter a 4th time. She wrote back the next morning. Mrs. Holt replied within a week. The family was still looking. The position would begin the 1st of April, if the candidate was prepared. The household was large but well staffed. The children were 4, 7, and 9. The widower, a Mr. Drummond Fairfax, was described as exacting but fair and very much in earnest about his children's welfare. There would be a cottage on the grounds, separate from the main house. There would be no one to share it with except Elspeth herself. She considered this for one evening. One long, quiet evening in the chair by the window, watching the garden go dark. Then she opened the small writing desk and began to make lists. What she owned. What had been gifts from her parents and might legitimately travel with her. What she had brought to the marriage that was still, in the clean light of legal fact, hers. She was organized by nature, and had always been precise about money. Within 2 hours she had a clear accounting of herself. She wrote to her aunt in Glasgow. She wrote to her mother, carefully, in the coded language women sometimes use with each other when they need to be heard without being intercepted. She made arrangements. She told Aldous on a Sunday. Not at breakfast, where Veldra would be present, and the morning would collapse into management and noise. She asked him to walk with her in the garden after church, and he had looked surprised. She so rarely asked him for anything, and said yes. The garden was muddy from a week of rain. They walked along the gravel path between the box hedges, and Elspeth kept her hands inside her coat, and she told him plainly. She was leaving. She had accepted a position in Inverness. She would be gone by the 28th, which was 10 days away. She was not asking his permission. She was informing him as a courtesy, because she believed he deserved the courtesy even if the marriage had not deserved her. He stopped walking. For a long moment he stood on the path and looked at the bare rose bushes and said nothing, and then he said very quietly, "Has my mother made it that difficult?" It was the most perceptive thing he had said to her in 2 years and 4 months. She felt the truth of it, like something physical, pressing against the inside of her chest. "It isn't only your mother," she said. "It's that you've let her." He looked at her then, and she saw, for the first time, something behind the settled quiet, something that might have been remorse if it had had more time and more oxygen. Something young and unhappy that he had locked behind the exhaustion so long ago that he'd nearly forgotten it was there. I don't know what I could have done differently, he said. I know you don't, she said. That's the saddest part of it. She left him standing on the path. She did not go downstairs for dinner that evening. She sent word through the housemaid that she had a headache and asked for a tray, and she sat with the tray, untouched, and finished packing the trunk. Veldra came to the door at 9 o'clock. She knocked twice, with the particular rhythm of a woman who considers knocking a formality rather than a genuine request. Elspeth said she was resting. There was a pause. She could feel the weight of it through the door, and then the sound of footsteps, withdrawing. She slept better than she had in months. The next 10 days were ordinary. She continued to appear at meals. She continued to say the right things. She had learned this skill so thoroughly that it cost her almost nothing now, the performing of normalcy. Veldra seemed to be watching her more closely than usual, but Veldra was always watching, and Elspeth gave her nothing to see. Aldous came to her sitting room on the 5th day. He stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets and looked at the half-empty shelves and the trunk with its hasps latched shut and said, I find I want to ask you to stay. I know, she said. And you won't. No. He nodded. He looked at the floor. Is there anything I can do? Practically. I mean to say, financially. I want to ensure. I have arranged everything, she said. I am quite capable of it. I know you are, he said. And then, after a pause, I think I always knew that. She looked at him for a long moment. There was so much she could have said. She chose the thing that was true without being cruel. You're not a bad man, Aldous. I want you to know I don't believe that. He nodded again. He left the doorway. She heard him on the stairs, the measured tread of a man walking carefully, and then the house took the sound and swallowed it. On the 28th, she rose before first light. She dressed without calling the maid, which she had always been capable of, and had sometimes forgotten she was allowed to be. The trunk had been arranged the night before. A hired coach was coming at 6. She carried her travel bag down the stairs herself, past the portraits in the hall, past the parlor with the wrong furniture arrangement that no one had ever corrected, past the morning room where Veldra had her first cup of tea every day at 7, which meant there was 1 hour of safety. She set the bag by the front door. She stood in the hallway of Whitmore House for a moment, in the dark before the dark lifted, and she thought about the woman who had walked into this house 2 years ago, 22, and certain that compliance was the same thing as grace. She did not think she was that woman anymore. She had learned things here, in spite of everything. She had learned that silence was not always absence, that she had been present and attentive, and fully herself, even when no one in the room could see it. She had learned that her own accounting of herself was more reliable than anyone else's. She had learned that patience applied correctly was not weakness. It was preparation. She picked up her bag. She did not curtsy. There was no one there to curtsy to. She opened the front door and stepped into the cold March morning, and the hired coach was already at the gate, the horse's breath rising in small clouds in the dark, and the driver climbed down and took the trunk from the step without being asked, and she got in. The house was behind her. The road was ahead. Inverness was 12 hours north, and Mrs. Holt's letter said the Drummond Fairfax children were lively and curious, and in need of exactly the sort of steady, clear-headed presence that no one in Whitmore House had ever asked Elspeth to be. She was 24 years old. She was going to be magnificent. It was not until 3 months later, on a Tuesday evening in June, that she received a letter from her aunt in Glasgow. The letter mentioned, in the way of letters that bury their news in the 3rd paragraph, that Aldous Whitmore had apparently done something no one expected. He had asked his mother to return to her own property in Dorset. He had arranged the move quietly, over a matter of weeks. He had not, her aunt reported, made any particular statement about his reasons. Elspeth read this sitting at the desk in her cottage, with the window open and the smell of the pines coming in from the hill behind the estate. The children were in bed. The house was quiet in the way of houses where the quiet had been earned. She folded the letter and put it in the cedar box, in the place where Mrs. Holt's first letter had been. She did not feel triumph. She had expected to, and she did not. What she felt was something quieter and harder to name, the feeling of a thing finally being right, like a joint settling into the correct position. Not dramatic, just true. She looked out the window for a while, at the hill and the dark line of the pines against the last of the light. Then she opened her account book and went back to work. And here's the second story for her family story. People see an old man who spent 30 years driving a city bus. What they don't talk about, what I've almost never talked about, is the 20 years before that, and what I did in them, and why I left. I'm 68 now. My wife passed 6 years ago. My grandson, who I'll call by his name because he earned it, Callum, though he goes by Cal, is 29. He works in commercial real estate development in Toronto. He's sharp in the way his grandmother was sharp. Gets to the heart of a problem before most people have finished reading the cover page. I'm proud of him in the complicated way grandfathers are proud. Which is to say I worry about him at the same percentage that I admire him, and both percentages are high. It was Cal who invited me to the dinner. A Thursday in February, one of those Toronto evenings, where the cold has a particular opinion about you, and the wind off the lake backs it up. He called me that morning and said his firm was hosting a client dinner, a developer from Montreal, very interested in a mixed-use project Cal had been leading, and that he'd like me to come. You want me to come to a work dinner, I said. I want you there, he said. There's a difference. I should have heard something in the way he said it. I didn't, or I did, and I told myself I was being an old man looking for ghosts. The restaurant was in Yorkville, the kind of place with no prices on the menu and a sommelier who speaks to the wine with more warmth than he speaks to the customers. I wore my good jacket, I polished my shoes. My wife always said I had a gift for looking like I belonged somewhere, even when I wasn't sure I did, and I tried to remember that on the walk from the parking garage. There were 5 of us at the table. Cal, a woman from his firm named Ingrid, who handled contracts. The client's associate, a quiet fellow named Sebastien, who took notes on everything, and the client himself, a man named Rémi Fontaine. Rémi Fontaine was 51. He was from Montreal, as Cal had said, and he spoke English with the careful precision of someone who has chosen every word for effect, and is aware of it. He wore an excellent suit, and a watch that was trying to tell you something about his income without quite shouting. He shook my hand when we were introduced, and called me Cal's grandfather, with a particular inflection, the kind that turns a description into a diminishment so lightly you almost don't catch it. Almost. I sat down. I unfolded my napkin. I picked up the menu. The conversation moved the way these conversations move. Around the project, around the neighborhood, around the opportunity. Cal was good. He's always been good in a room. He had done his homework and it showed, and a couple of times I watched Fontaine nod in a way that looked like genuine approval, which settled something in me. We ordered. The food came, the good kind that arrives in portions sized for aesthetic contemplation rather than appetite. Sebastien continued to take notes. Ingrid handled a point about the contract structure with quiet expertise. The wine was poured. And then Fontaine leaned slightly towards Sebastien and said something in French. My French is not what it was in the years I don't talk about. It's been decades, and language has a way of wearing down without use, the way a tool rusts if you leave it in the shed. But the core of it is still there, laid into me in the early 70s in a particular kind of school that no longer exists. Because the government that ran it decided it had been an error. What Fontaine said, in French, at a volume that assumed no one at the table would follow, was this. The grandson's idea is good. The grandfather is here to make him look established. Old world charm. The grandmother probably made excellent bread. Sebastien made a small sound that was the professional cousin of a laugh. I looked at my plate. The salmon was excellent. I noted this about myself, that I was aware of the quality of the salmon in the moment after a man described me as a prop. I have always processed things in layers, a habit I developed professionally and never quite lost. I did not look at Cal. I knew, without looking, that he hadn't caught it. His French is functional at best. He had a semester of it in high school, and absorbed what he needed to navigate Montreal meetings, which was not enough to follow a quiet side conversation about bread-baking grandmothers. I ate my salmon. Fontaine continued in English, talking about a project he'd developed in Quebec City, the challenges of the Heritage District, the community consultation process. He spoke well. He was, setting everything aside, a genuinely intelligent man with real experience. This is the thing I have never been able to make simple, that a person can be worth listening to and still be precisely the kind of person he had just revealed himself to be. The main course came. Over the duck, Fontaine leaned toward Sebastien again, this time in French, quieter. Let's see how much the boy actually controls. These young ones sometimes need the old man's money more than they need to admit. I set down my fork, not the way Elspeth Vane set hers down in the Victorian novels my wife used to read, clean and decisive and legible. I set mine down the way I set things down now, which is slowly, because my right shoulder has an opinion about sharp movements in cold weather. I looked at Rémi Fontaine. He was reaching for his wine glass. He hadn't looked at me. I was the prop, the old world charm, the grandmother's bread. Your Quebec City project, I said in French. The one in the Heritage District. That would be the Cartier Block development, 2019. His hand stopped on the wineglass stem. The community consultation process was handled by a firm called Belanger and Associates, I said, still in French, still at a conversational pace. The third round of consultations was contested by 3 residence groups, and the settlement involved a setback adjustment on the northwest corner. I know this because I was brought in as an independent mediator for part of that process before I retired. I paused. My French, as you may have gathered, is adequate. The table was very quiet. I looked at Sébastien, who had stopped writing. I looked at Cal, who was very still, watching me the way he'd watched me when he was 7 years old, and I'd produced something unexpected from a pocket, a coin, a small puzzle, and he hadn't yet figured out the mechanism. I switched back to English. I think the project Cal's team has put forward is sound, I said to Fontaine, to the table, to the room. The heritage compliance is thorough, the community timeline is realistic, and the partnership structure is well considered. These are Cal's judgments. I'm here for dinner. Fontaine set his wineglass down. He looked at me for a moment with the expression of a man doing rapid internal calculations. Your French is excellent, he said in French. It's passable, I said. I used to be better. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said in English with something that was almost genuine, I apologize. That was poorly done of me. I nodded. I picked up my fork. The duck was still warm, which was a mercy. I should tell you about the 20 years since we've arrived here. I grew up in Windsor, Ontario, the third of 4 children of a man who drove a truck and a woman who taught school and believed, with a conviction I have since come to understand was a form of love, that her children would be educated into something better than their circumstances. She was right about 3 of us. The 4th, my younger brother, found his own kind of better, which I won't go into here because it's his story to tell. I went to the University of Ottawa in 1974 on a partial scholarship and a loan and a great deal of stubbornness. I studied linguistics and political science because I couldn't decide between them and discovered in the second year that they were the same subject from different angles. I had a talent for language, not just for grammar and vocabulary, but for the texture of it, the way meaning moves differently in different tongues, the way a conversation has a shape that you can feel before you can name. A professor named Dr. Ouellet noticed this. He made a phone call. The phone call led to an interview in Ottawa, and the interview led to a second interview in a building on Spark Street that doesn't exist anymore. And the second interview led to a position I am still not at liberty to describe with complete specificity. I will say, I was trained in French, Russian, and enough Mandarin to be useful in particular contexts. I was deployed in roles that required the precise kind of listening that Fontaine had assumed I was incapable of. I spent 2 years in Brussels, 18 months in Hong Kong, a period in various other places that I experienced, mostly through the windows of rooms I was not supposed to be recognized in. It was a life that suited my mind and was wrong for almost everything else. I met my wife on a Thursday afternoon in 1981, in the Ottawa Public Library, where she was returning a book on economic history, and I was returning a French novel, and we reached the desk at the same moment. She was a nurse. She was the least complicated person I had ever met, by which I mean she was entirely herself, always, without apology and without theater, and I found this quality so rare and so stabilizing that I restructured my entire existence around it within approximately 14 months. I left the service in 1984. We moved to Toronto. I became a bus driver, which was a thing my colleagues found either baffling or deeply funny, and which I found, after 20 years of rooms in which nothing was as it appeared, entirely and profoundly restoring. I drove the same route for 11 years. I knew my regulars by their stop, their time, the way they moved when they were tired or running late. Nobody was pretending to be anything. It was the best work of my life, and I don't say that ironically. I had never told Cal any of this. My wife knew all of it. Our son, Cal's father, knew the outline, enough to understand why we didn't discuss it at family dinners. Cal had grown up knowing his grandfather had driven a bus and had some interesting stamps in an old passport that he'd found once and been told to put down. In the car after the dinner, Cal drove. He does this when something is working in him, takes the wheel so he has something to do with his hands. Brussels, he said finally. You said Brussels. I said I'd been in Brussels. And Hong Kong, among other places. He was quiet for a block or two. The city went past, the storefronts, the lit windows, the ordinary ongoing life of a February Thursday. How long, he said. 20 years, near enough, and you drove a bus, and I drove a bus, I agreed. It was the right call. He was quiet again. I watched the streetlights. Did you know, he said carefully, that Fontaine has been doing this, on other projects, in other rooms, I turned to look at him. "There's a woman at a firm in Calgary," he said. "She's been in the room twice on calls with his team. He has a way of dismissing people in French when he thinks they can't follow. It's been documented. She documented it herself but didn't know what to do with it." "Who is she?" I said. "Her name's Odette Tremblay. She's bilingual. She caught every word. She just didn't have anyone who would believe her over him, because he's the client." He exhaled. "He's a significant client. Is she willing to speak about it, formally?" She said she would be, if there was someone else, if she wasn't the only one. I looked at the passing street. I thought about Fontaine over the duck, the easy assumption of invisibility, the way he'd smiled at Sebastien, the way he'd made his apology to me, genuine enough once he had to, but offered only because the cost-benefit had changed. I thought about Odette Tremblay sitting in a room in Calgary, having heard every word, holding it alone. I know something about holding things alone. I know the weight of it, and the way it shapes a person over time if nothing comes to relieve it. "I'll write a statement," I said. "Signed, dated, formal, whatever form is useful." Cal nodded once, the way his grandmother used to nod when a thing was decided. We drove the rest of the way without talking, which was the comfortable kind of not talking, the kind that means nothing more needs to be said. The statement I wrote was 3 pages, precise, chronological, and included a transcript of both French exchanges as nearly verbatim as my memory allowed, which, after 20 years of professional retention, was close enough for the purpose. Cal submitted it to his firm's legal team. Odette Tremblay submitted her own account. Fontaine's firm was notified. I don't know the full outcome. These things move through channels I'm no longer part of, and I haven't asked Cal to report back to me on it as though it's my business. It isn't, not entirely. It was his project, his room, his decision about what to do next. What I know is that Fontaine did not get the contract. What I know is that Odette Tremblay sent Cal a short message 3 weeks later that he read to me over the phone, and the last line of it was, "Tell your grandfather, I've never been so glad to be wrong about something." I didn't understand it at first. Cal explained. She had assumed, sitting in those calls, that no one was listening, that she was alone in it. She hadn't been. She just hadn't known. I thought about that for a while after I hung up. I sat in the kitchen of my house in Windsor. I moved back after my wife died, to be nearer to her grave and to the lake, and to the version of myself that had started there, and I thought about what it costs to sit in a room and hold what you know without being able to do anything with it. I've sat in a lot of rooms. I've held a lot of things. Most of them I'll take to the same grave as my wife. But some things I've learned are worth carrying out into the open. The right moment is worth waiting for. The right language is worth knowing. You never know when God will put you in exactly the right room, at exactly the right time, knowing exactly the right words. I drove a city bus for 30 years and I always said good morning to my passengers. Not one of them knew where I'd been, not one of them needed to. But I am glad, at 68, sitting in the kitchen of the house where I was born, that I went to that dinner in February, in my good jacket with my polished shoes, and that I sat down at that table, and that I listened. Some conversations need a witness who understands every word.